Us as human beings are extremely complex. Throughout any given day, we might show 1,000 different sides of ourselves and our personality. I might be a charitable legend one moment and play with my cat even though I'm really not in the mood. And then I might be a villain when I roll my eyes at the person making my burrito at Chipotle when they give me like 3 pieces of chicken. If someone had a camera on me all day and had the job of editing all that footage down to only 15 minutes, they could do a couple different things with that footage. They could edit in all my good moments to make me look my best. They could edit in all my shady moments to make me look my worst. Or they could edit in both my best and my worst moments and make me look like a well-rounded human. And boom, that's reality TV in a nutshell. Every good story has heroes and villains, and most people in a high-tension environment probably give the storytellers ammunition that they need to make them either one. When you sign up to appear on reality TV, you relinquish your rights to drive your narrative in any way. That right goes to the showrunners, producers, and editors. And based on what they do with the material that you gave them, they could either make you America's sweetheart or their nemesis. I don't think the producers of RuPaul's Drag Race truly saw just how much power behind the stories of these queens that appear on the show they had until season 4, our first big hero versus villain story arc. But it would not be the last, and in years since, we've seen them weaponize this immense power to varying degrees. So, let's solve this mystery. Who are the true villains of RuPaul's Drag Race? If you are not already, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have the notification bell on. And check out my Instagram and my Twitter and also my Patreon. We're going to be doing a trivia night coming up next week. And you can win Denali merch, so make sure you check that out. I do want to preface this video by saying I know Tyra Sanchez and Fifi O'Hara both do not go by these names anymore, but I'm going to be discussing their time on the show, so I will be using their drag names in this video. I am also going to be mentioning some deeply problematic humans such as Sharon Needles and Sherry Pie. Unfortunately, they are integral to speaking on the theme of this video, so just a slight trigger warning for that. Now, let's get into the video. One thing I need to highlight right off the bat is that most queens that appear on the show don't get a straight-up hero or villain edit. They fall somewhere in the middle. Getting a real villain edit is actually pretty rare. And this is due to a lot of reasons, especially in more recent seasons where we have a final 4 who lip-sync for the crown. In earlier seasons, there was a top 3 and production could just crown whoever they wanted. It was easier to make queens who made it to the end into villains since they had full control over who they were going to crown. A villain has never won this show, mostly due to marketability. The producers know when they dish out a true villain edit to a queen, she is going to be despised by the fandom. Probably sent death threats, their families are probably going to get sent death threats, and that's not someone that they want to carry the torch of the show. So with this new finale format, yes, they can still hold some power in eliminating the queens they want, but if the heroes absolutely flop in their lip syncs, there's not much they can do. So we're going to see the frequency of true villain edits dip after season 8. But let's take a look at the seasons one at a time and break down which queens got a full-on villain edit. There's a difference between a shady edit and a villain edit, and the first 3 seasons definitely are heavy-handed on the shady edits. Akasha and Rebecca and Chanel on season 1, Tatiana, Raven, and Tyra on season 2, all of the Heathers on season 3, they all get edited as pretty shady people who do have a nasty side to them, but the edit doesn't bury them like it does a true villain, and you're going to hear me say bury a lot this video, but it just means the edit does them absolutely no favors and makes them look at their absolute worst, the entire show, basically. There's still a rootability factor in all of these queens. We see their hardships, we see them have good moments, and the edit clearly wants us to still like them to some degree. Probably because, with the exception of Akasha, they all make it to the end of their season. A lot of the other queens dislike Rebecca, and we get a lot of confessionals from them talking about how terrible she is, but the edit never actually shows us her being that horrible. We just have to trust and believe the other queens when they say that she is. And we get a lot of human moments with Rebecca, like during the Mac AIDS challenge and during the reunion where she and Jade make up. So these are things that kind of point me into saying she didn't get an actual villain edit. A lot of the queens on season 1 get shady edits. Chanel, BB, Jade, Akasha, Rebecca. I would say only Angina and Nina truly dodge getting that edit. And because everyone is being shady and everyone has their snotty moments, it doesn't make Rebecca look all that bad in comparison. Season 2 is an even better example of this. Everyone on this cast is shady as hell. They're all being snobby and rude to each other. So when all the queens are calling out Tyra for being rude, we're like, okay, and you are too, so what's the point here? I do think in the first 3 seasons, Tyra is the queen who has the closest thing to a villain edit. The edit does bury her a little bit in the wedding challenge episode, but we're also made to look at her in a sympathetic light during a lot of the season as well, probably because she was the winner. Morgan, Mystique, Jujubee, Raven, Tyra, Tatiana, Sahara, and Sonique are all given very shady edits. Yes, I just named almost the entire cast. And while Tyra comes off the season probably looking the worst, it still wasn't like a full-on villain edit, because who was the hero to counter her? Tatiana? Tatiana was also a bitch that season. So Raven is definitely the villain in her storyline with Tatiana, who is the clear hero, but we see Raven being a great friend to Jujubee, and most of her shade is passed off as jokes until the reunion. So while some of these edits could be considered in that gray area between villain and shady, neither are full-fledged villain edits, in my opinion. Now, season 3, we have the whole storyline between the Heathers and the Boogers, and this sets up the clear heroes and the clear villains. But the problem is the Heathers, who are the villains, are the ones who make the finals. So they couldn't really give them full-fledged villain edits, or else there would be 2 villains in the final 2, and fans would probably not be happy to see that. So instead, we see a lot more layers to Raja and Manila throughout the season that help to balance out their edit. Alright, now we move on to season 4. Bring out Fifi O'Hara. She gave the producers everything necessary to craft their first true villain edit. But there is no villain without a hero, and Sharon Needles was the perfect queen to play that role. Immediately, a power imbalance is created between the queens. Fifi is a pageant queen with titles and notoriety and beautiful stuff, and Sharon is an underground queen who doesn't have the money or resources that Fifi does. We know now that Sharon and Fifi were completely aware of the storylines they were creating and even faked some of their fights on the season to give producers more material to work with. The difference between Fifi and the shady queens before her is she completely gets buried in the edit. Basically, every single thing she says all season long is accompanied by this. We see very little about her personal life or things that would make her sympathetic in any way, and she just doesn't fight with Sharon. She fights with Willem, she fights with Jiggly. Many queens tell us in the confessional that they don't like her, and it is ingrained in our brains by the end of the season that Fifi is the devil incarnate. So much so that to this day, people still will watch the season and flock to her DMs to call her every terrible name imaginable. And that is the main difference between Fifi and the queens mentioned prior. Tyra definitely got her fair share of hate after season 2, but the edit doesn't really reflect the amount of hate that she got like Fifi's did. I didn't leave season 2 with the impression that the editors wanted me to form an angry mob outside of Tyra's house. Watching season 4, it was very clear producers wanted audiences to despise Fifi with every fiber of their being. This is still to this day, I think, the most brutal and explicit villain edit, probably because every queen auditioning saw how she was reaped over the coals even a decade later, and knew they couldn't behave in the same way if they wanted their careers to flourish, like, at all. So while we do see more villain edits moving forward, they're a bit tamer than Miss Fifi's, and for the sake of these queens' mental health and careers, I am happy about that. The following season, season 5, is probably the second most famous villain edit on Drag Race. But before we talk about Miss Thick and Juicy, I want to talk quickly about another queen on the season who got a legit villain edit, and it's one we don't really talk about all that often. It's Serena Chacha. Now, this edit isn't talked about, I think, because she was only present for 2 episodes. But wow, in those 2 episodes, the edit destroys her. She's basically presented to us as the annoying young queen who thinks she's hot shit just because she went to college. And Serena does herself no favors with some of the things that she says. This is one of the few times in Drag Race that literally every single contestant turn on a single queen. The other example is Mimi I'm First in All Stars 1, but Mimi is kind of portrayed in a sympathetic light in that season, so she dodged the villain edit there. But yeah, Serena is basically only shown to us when she's saying something bratty or annoying, and she gets called out by every single queen in the competition, and then she goes home. So, a short but fun villain edit. Okay, Roxxxy Andrews. When you think about season 5, it basically just mashes together Fifi versus Sharon and then Heathers versus Boogers to craft its main narrative. And I can see why. I mean, those were the 2 most interesting things about the prior 2 seasons. But this season does it in a much more of a slow burn approach. Jinx is very obviously the hero of this season, with Rolascatox, mainly Roxxxy, being the villain. But it doesn't tell us this right off the bat like they do with Fifi and Sharon the season prior. They let the narrative form over time. Jinx is slowly built up as a sympathetic figure and the underdog, and Roxxxy is slowly built up as our main villain of the season, with it all coming to a head in the season's final 4 episode, when just Jinx and Rolascatox remain. And honestly, it's incredible storytelling. Another big difference between Roxxxy and Fifi's edits, besides the pace, is the inclusion of more sympathetic moments for Roxxxy. Her famous telling of the story of her being left at a bus stop by her mother gives us more insight to her as a person, which is insight we never got about Fifi. We also get kind of a role reversal from Fifi and Sharon's story arc here. Fifi was painted as jealous of Sharon's performance in the season, as Sharon was slaying, but Roxxxy is seen as the front runner by most people, and all of Jinx's accomplishments are diminished by Rolascatox. It's a really great edit, and I'm glad it let us know Roxxxy more than it did Fifi, but of course that didn't stop the fans from flooding her DMs with death threats, and after this, villain edits kind of aren't the same. Season 6 doesn't have a clear villain. Instead, we get a lot of more one-on-one rivalries. Courtney versus Jocelyn, Darian versus Ben, Bianca versus Laganja. And Courtney, Darian, and Bianca could be seen as the villain in these story arcs, but the other parts of their edits counteract the negativity. Darian probably comes off this season looking the worst, but I just don't see it as a full-fledged villain edit there, because some of her points against Ben are seen as justified in the edit. And outside of that relationship, she doesn't really have many more villainous tendencies. Okay, moving on to season 7, it's hella complicated because this entire cast is completely shady and they all hate each other. So, by just looking at the first episode, it seems like Fame and Candy are going to be the season's villains. But Fame ends up being one of the heroes, Violet gets a redemption arc, and Candy basically disappears after episode 1 until she goes home. So, who's the villain then? Jasmine Masters, for sure, gets the villain edit, especially since she comes for queens who are edited to us in a sympathetic light, like Trixie Mattel and Max. She also gets the delusional edit somewhat as well, but basically we only hear from Jasmine when she has something mean to say about another queen for the most part. She doesn't really last long enough for her edit to be very dynamic or fleshed out, but what we do see is just straight up villain. Now, the final 4 of this season all have their villainous moments, but it really paints Ginger and Kennedy as the villains, and Violet and Pearl as the heroes. Now, I'm hesitant to say Ginger got a villain edit, though, since she was the narrator of the season, and I get the vibe that the editors wanted us to like her. Kennedy, on the other hand, I'm just gonna say she got a villain edit. I do think you could argue against this. We do learn about her life, we do see her have genuine friendships with queens like Katya and Jasmine, but it seems like every time they cut to her in confessional, they use their handy-dandy shade button. Kennedy has a pretty monotonous voice, so with the added shade button, it really just makes everything she says sound bitchy as hell. This, coupled with her harsh final speech at the Final Four, where she is then immediately eliminated, despite having one of the better track records, gave me very "the evil has been defeated" energy. I wouldn't say she gets buried in the edit, but her last episode definitely does not paint her in a good light whatsoever. I think of all the queens I've given the villain edit to so far, Kennedy's is the most in that gray area, but I think in my opinion there are enough factors that tell me it was a villain edit and not just a shady edit. So moving on to season 8, our villain is obviously Acid Betty. I swear there's not a single millisecond this bitch isn't on screen and we don't hear. I think this edit isn't talked about much either, since she doesn't make it super far in the season, but I mean, talk about getting buried, and her getting owned by Trixie Mattel in the finale just added heat to that fire. This one is just so cut and dry to me. We learn nothing about her personal life, constant music cues telling us she's being bitchy, and multiple other queens telling us how horrible and shady she is. Staple villain edit. I'm gonna say Derek Barry does not get the villain edit. She gets more of the delusional edit, in my opinion, with a redemption arc towards the end of the season. She definitely has villainous moments, but the show portrays it more as like delusion than malice. So, season 9, the season that's been called RuPaul's Best Friend Race. Yeah, there's really no villain here. Alexis Michelle doesn't come off looking great, but she definitely has layers to her edit, and it's not all bad. Valentina is buried in the reunion episode, one of the most glaring examples in the entire series of this. But the edit for her entire time in the competition does not reflect this at all, so yeah, not really a villain edit. So let's go to season 10, our next example of a glaring villain edit. The vixen. Wow, this one is rough. This is the first one where I was watching it and in the moment was like, why is she being portrayed like this? At the time of airing, a lot of the fans were questioning why Vixen got the edit here and not Aquaria or Eureka, who, from the looks of what we saw in the season, were the ones instigating their feuds with the Vixen. But, if we just take a look at who made the final 3 of the season and who didn't, I guess we can all see why. The Vixen comes into the season with the entrance line, "I'm just here to fight," and the editor said, "Okay, we heard you, sis." The funny thing is, the Vixen even calls out that Eureka and Aquaria starting shit with her could create the narrative of Vixen being the stereotypical angry black woman, and the show literally airs her saying this, and then edits her as the angry black woman. I 100% disagree with this edit, but I cannot deny that it is there, and it is glaringly obvious. RuPaul basically chases her off the set of the reunion, coming for her because of her behavior. What we do get from this edit, that we don't see from many others though, is, quote, justification for her behavior. They dive into how she was treated as a child and how she's treated in Chicago because of her race, and how it's made her into a combative person, and then they still continue to edit her as the villain. So, season 11, what can you say about season 11? It gives me very season 2 vibes, where half the cast are just constantly ripping each other to shreds and obviously hate each other. The editors basically could have justifiably edited almost anyone on this season as a villain, but really only 2 kind of leave the season with what I would call a villain edit, and that is Silky Nutmeg Ganache and Raja O'Hara. These are both pretty obvious edits. Silky is the villain to Evie's hero story, and Raja is the villain to Scarlett's hero story. Raja especially has a very Acid Betty edit where the only time we ever hear from her is when she's saying something scathing about another queen. Constant shade sounds whenever she's on screen, made out to look completely delusional, nothing too new or different. Now, Silky, on the other hand, gets kind of the same edit as Fifi or Roxxxy did, where they didn't see in our hero what the judges and what America see, and aim to cut her down at every chance they get. People like to say that they think the producers thought fans would like Silky, but I mean, I have to disagree here because right off the bat in episode 1, they get to work on burying her. Half the queens are saying negative things about her in their confessionals by the end of the first episode, and we're made to see Silky as annoying, attention seeking, and delusional. And the edit never really tries to undo this or give her any type of redemption. Instead, when she starts to come for Evie, we're immediately meant to take Evie's side since we've had Evie portrayed to us as the underdog weirdo, much like they did with Sharon and Jinx many seasons prior. Silky, in my opinion, gets one of the worst edits I've ever seen on Drag Race. Sometimes she gets to just be funny and we learn little things about her life, but for the most part, the edit highlights her delusions about herself, her judgment against other queens, and what other queens perceive as her obnoxious personality. It's rough. It's really, really rough. That leads us to season 12, where I personally think if Sherry Pie wasn't completely edited out of the season, she probably would have been our villain. And the first episode she appears in, where she's still in the edit, I think shows this. The edit very much set up a Jada versus Sherry storyline, and given how much of a positive edit Jada got, I'm led to believe Sherry probably would not have gotten as positive of an edit. The lack of a villain at all in season 12 supports this theory. I guess you could say Britta is the season's villain, but she definitely didn't get a villain edit, and really I think she just looked bad because every other queen was so sweet and nice. So that leads us to season 13, and interestingly enough, there's no villain edit here either. I know a lot of people like to say Candy Muse was the villain, but she actually gets a very well-rounded edit. We learn a lot about her personal life, we see her friendships with queens like Gottmik and Tina, we see her good moments and her bad moments. I feel like Elliot could have definitely been the villain from what a lot of the queens have said post-season, but since most of her villainous moments on set seem to be centered around racist and transphobic things she was saying, I could see why VH1 did not want to highlight this behavior and instead just left it out. Especially after the Sherry controversy the year prior, another big controversy probably would not look good on their end. So now we can quickly talk a little bit about All Stars. All Stars 1, it was too fast for there to be any villains. All Stars 2, Fifi is very much the villain again. Without a doubt. It's one of the best edited villain arcs I've ever seen, and while I'm so sorry that she got so much hate from it, it was such good television. All Stars 3, I'm on the fence with Milk's edit. I'm leaning more towards it just being a delusional edit and not being a villain edit. It has some factors of a villain edit, like there being a clear hero to her villain in Kennedy, and the lack of any personal content, but the queens don't really speak negatively of her character, more just calling her delusional in her perception of her own self. And we don't get the shady music cues with her, instead we get delusional music cues. So I'm going to leave her out and say it was a delusional edit, not a villain edit. But to be honest, I could probably be convinced on this one being a villain edit. All Stars 4, obviously Gia Gunn is the villain. She got more of just a shady edit on season 6, but here she's full-on villain. But we know that she was in on the joke and was giving the producers all the content they asked for to give her this edit, and she does get a slight redemption arc in her elimination episode. But yeah, this is more of a fun villain edit, not like some of the nasty ones we saw where queens like Silky and Roxxxy get destroyed postseason. All Stars 5, obviously the villain was India Farah. If you would have told me even 2 years ago that India Farah would be the main villain on an All-Star season, I would have laughed in your face. But yeah, and it looks like she's continuing her villain edit in real life too, so that's fun. Side note, it sounds like from what the other queens have said post-season, The material was there for Cracker to have a full-fledged villain edit, but I'm assuming as the queen with the best track record on the season, producers didn't want to completely bury her in case they might want to crown her. So yeah, here we are. I counted 12 villain edits in the main Drag Race series. And yes, it's not lost on me that 10 of these 12 queens are queens of color. Do better, VH1. Fifi is still the only queen to get the villain edit twice. But, I mean, there is the potential for All-Star 6 to give us our second 2-time villain edit. So we will just have to wait and see. You guys might have a different number than me for how many villain edits there are. So what do you think? Did I miss someone? Do you think someone that I listed didn't deserve to get a villain edit, or their edit just simply wasn't a villain edit? I want to hear your thoughts. I think this could be the start of a new series, so let me know in the comment section what kind of edit would you like to see me tackle next. Here are all of my socials, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. Also, here are my patrons. Thank you guys so much. And it has been a long day of solving the mystery of how many shade sounds accompanied Raja O'Hara during season 11. And the answer is...
the limit does not exist.
Thank you guys, and I will see you in the next one.